And then you can go ahead and place your other image into your document as well. And you'll see right here, my background is a jar, and I'll go File, Place Embedded, and then I'll navigate to the image of my dancer and place it in there as well. And you can see down here in the layers is the image of my dancer. And I can click this to set the image in place or just hit return, both will work. Now what I want to do is isolate the dancer from the background. So of course there's lots of different ways to select things. In this case, I'm going to try using the object selection tool. When you have an image that's on a background that's got a lot of contrast, this tool works much better, but it still isn't always perfect. So I'm gonna put a selection around my dancer and let go and see how Photoshop does. And it did a pretty good job. It had some trouble here with the sole, the rubber sole around the shoe, and this negative space in between the legs, maybe right there around the fingers. So you can always use the zoom tool to check your selection. And then for this one, I'm going to use the quick selection tool just to add to it. And up at the top, I can see that I'm adding, because it's got the plus. If I'm on this selection here, it'll just, anything I select will create a new selection. This will subtract from my already selected selection, and this will add to it. So I want to add. So I'm just clicking inside the things I want to add. This looks good. I want to add that part there. And then I want to subtract this white bit here, this negative space. So I can change the tool to a subtract tool. And I'm just clicking in the area that I want to subtract. And Photoshop is doing a pretty good job of figuring it out. So I'm going to go through the rest of this. The hands look pretty good. And keep in mind, he's going to be inside the jar. So there's going to be some amount of distortion that happens. So I want my selection to be as close to perfect as possible, but I'm not going to sweat the details here. That's a pretty darn good selection. I could have used the quick selection tool from the start to make my whole selection, but I just wanted to show you some options for how to select your subject. And then from here, I could either just create a mask right here, add layer mask, or I like to go up and use this select and mask window to check my selection and make any refinements if I need it. This looks pretty good. Remember, your view mode here just allows you to see your selection on different backgrounds. I like the overlay here because it gives me a really good idea of what is selected. And this opacity slider here kind of blends it with the original, right? So depending on where yours is, you can adjust this opacity slider to see your full selection there, or go back to the original to see if you've missed anything. Once you're happy with your selection, you scroll down to the very bottom, and under output settings, this is an important one. You want to output your selection to a new layer with layer mask. Make sure you're including that layer mask because we want to be able to add and subtract to our selection at a later date. So if we add that layer mask, that gives us that flexibility. And there you can see the black is what's being hidden and the white on the layer mask is what's being shown. So now I can grab my move tool and I can move my dancer around, and I'm going to just transform by pulling this edge to make him smaller and kind of decide where I want to place him in the jar. And I think it'll be cool if there's a little bit of this reflection of light coming through, and then we have the logo, the ball logo there. We'll have that overlay as well. I like the pose he's doing with his hands, so I want to be able to see that too. And you can go bigger or smaller to your discretion. There you go. And again, the check mark up here will place it, or a return will do the same. Now he really looks like he's just slapped right on top. It looks like he's in front of the jar, and we want to give the appearance that he is jumping up and striking this pose inside the jar. So we're gonna go to our layer mask, and this is why that layer mask was so important. And we're gonna softly paint in a little bit of opacity of these reflections of light and the details of the jar so that it looks like he's behind it. Before we do that, you can tell that the color palette and the lighting for the background and the color palette for our dancer are different. And if you want to blend them a little bit better, you can add a gradient map. I'll show you how to do that and clip it to just the dancer. So I'm going to start with that. And my gradient map, I can get to it down here in my adjustment layers. And that's just the little circle that's half kind of gray, half white. And I'm going to find gradient map, and it's going to default to whatever my last gradient map was, which was a negative. And it's also being applied to the whole image, and I don't want it to be applied to the whole image. So I'm going to right click on the gradient map to create a clipping mask. And now I can see that that gradient map is only being applied to the dancer, but he's still negative, so I don't want to do that. So I'm going to click inside the properties tab here, right inside the gradient, to open up my gradient editor. And I can edit the colors of my gradient here by clicking on these little chips underneath the gradient. So I'm going to start with the white chip here. I'm going to double click on it. And I want it to be kind of this darkish sienna color. So I'm going to choose a darker brown here and hit OK. And then I'm going to come over to the black chip, click on that, double click on it to open up my color picker. And this I want to be more of this golden hue up here, kind of a creamy golden hue. And there we go. And I'll hit OK. And that's a little too heavy-handed. So right over here on the gradient map, I'm just going to slide the opacity slider down to kind of just blend it with the color palette of, I don't want the full gradient map. I just want that nice kind of sienna tone. And now it's kind of fitting in a little bit better, but I still have the problem of the reflections. I want him to look like he's jumping up inside the jar. So I'm going to go back to my dancer layer and make sure that my mask is selected. And I can tell it's selected because there is this frame around the mask, not a frame around the thumbnail of the image. I want the frame around the mask. And what that allows me to do is come over with my paintbrush. And if I'm painting with black and white, I can kind of start to hide away this stuff, but I don't want to completely hide his arm and hand. So I'm just going to adjust the opacity slider of my tool here. And by default, yours might be at 100, the flow and the opacity here. So I'm going to bring down the flow, which is how fast it comes out. And I want to bring down the opacity, right? So I want it to be kind of see-through. I just want to kind of start to blend these. And as I go through, I'm just sort of following where the light is on the jar to make it look like he's behind the glass, right? There we go. And I'm just painting through here. And now this right here, the word, the B in ball, I want to trace around that part of the jar. So I'm going to bring down the opacity of the dancer again, just so I can see where that lettering is. And I'm going to bring the opacity up because I want that to be pretty strong. And now my brush is way too big. So I'm going to click on the left bracket to make my brush smaller. And I'm just going to start painting around to hide the dancer behind the letter B. And you can adjust the opacity up again just to see. I just hit it so that I could see where the cursive was on there. And so it has more of like that embossed look. And then I'm going to bring up my brush size again by hitting the right bracket. And I'm going to come through and just lightly bring down the opacity, lightly add some more see-through kind of quality to this. And now that's looking a little bit better. It seems like it feels like he's more behind there. I'll add that little burst of light or reflection. And then you can add another gradient map. I can copy this gradient map even, right click and duplicate that layer. But I'll release the clipping mask on it, release the clipping mask. So it's covering the whole thing, right? And then I can adjust the opacity as much or as little as I want to kind of give it that overall blended look. So it feels more unified. And at any point, if you feel like you want parts of your subject to come through, you can reverse the white and black. Remember, white will show and black will hide. So you can just paint around to your liking until it feels complete. And that is how you can create your in a jam image. Thanks so much.